They thought I was weak because I always gave in. They were wrong. I was just waiting for the right moment to show them real strength. My name is Madison, and I never imagined my wedding day would become a battlefield. Growing up in a single-wide trailer with my mom after Dad left when I was 7, I learned early that nothing comes easy. While other kids complained about chores, I was working at the local diner every weekend, saving every dollar for college. That scholarship to State University wasn't luck. It was 4 years of straight A's while working 2 jobs. When I met James in my senior year, I wasn't looking for a Prince Charming. I was too focused on graduating summa cum laude and landing my first real job. But James was different. He didn't care that my shoes were from Payless or that I clipped coupons religiously. He saw something in me that even I was still discovering. Strength that came from struggle. Compassion that came from knowing what it meant to go without. James came from old money. Not flashy new rich money, but the kind that whispers instead of shouts. His family owned a chain of successful hardware stores across 3 states, built by his great-grandfather during the Depression. Their house wasn't just big, it was a monument to generations of success. Crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors watching your every move. His mother, Patricia, made it clear from day one that I wasn't what she had in mind for her precious son. During our first dinner at their house, she asked about my people with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. When I mentioned my mom worked double shifts at the hospital cafeteria, Patricia's fork paused mid-air for just a second too long. "How admirable," she said, the word dripping with condescension. Over the next 2 years, Patricia perfected the art of subtle warfare. She'd compliment my dress while mentioning how expensive good fabric was. She'd ask about my job while sighing about how exhausting it must be to work so hard just to get by. Every family gathering became a minefield of backhanded comments and pointed observations about breeding and proper upbringing. But James stood by me. When his mother suggested he might want to explore his options before settling down, he shut it down immediately. When she made comments about gold diggers at family dinners, he called her out every single time. That's when I knew he was the one, not because he had money, but because he had integrity. There was one person in that intimidating family who watched everything with knowing eyes, James's grandmother, Eleanor. At 85, she was sharp as a tack and twice as observant. While Patricia held court with her criticisms, Eleanor would catch my eye and give me the smallest wink. She never said much during those tense family dinners, but I always felt like she was taking notes. Eleanor had built that family fortune alongside her late husband, starting with nothing but determination and a small loan. She'd seen the business grow from one tiny shop to an empire, weathering the Depression, 2 wars, and countless economic downturns. When she looked at me, I sensed recognition, not of status or breeding, but of something deeper. Work ethic, resilience, the kind of character that money can't buy. The engagement announcement sent Patricia into overdrive. Suddenly, every conversation became about wedding planning, and every suggestion was a test I was destined to fail. The venue I chose was quaint but not quite right for their social circle. My dress preference was sweet, but perhaps not formal enough. My choice of flowers showed creativity but lacked sophistication. I tried to include her, hoping that involvement might bridge the gap between us. Instead, she used every planning session as an opportunity to highlight my inadequacies. When I mentioned keeping costs reasonable, she gasped about cutting corners on James's special day. When I suggested simple elegance, she worried aloud about what their friends would think. The morning of our wedding, I woke up with a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with normal wedding nerves. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but I felt like I was walking into an execution. My mom had driven up the night before, her one good dress pressed and hanging carefully in the hotel closet. She'd saved for months to help with wedding expenses, and I could see the worry in her eyes every time Patricia made another suggestion that would cost thousands. The venue was beautiful, a historic mansion with gardens that looked like something from a fairy tale. Patricia had insisted on upgrading almost everything I'd originally chosen, and while the result was undeniably stunning, it felt more like her wedding than mine. 200 guests filled the space. most of whom I'd never met but who were apparently essential to the family's social standing. As I walked down the aisle, I tried to focus on James waiting at the altar, his eyes bright with love and joy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Patricia was somewhere behind me, making mental notes of everything that wasn't quite perfect enough. The flowers were gorgeous, but were they the right shade? The music was beautiful, but was it sophisticated enough? My dress was stunning, but would it photograph well enough for the society pages? The ceremony went smoothly, thank God. James's vows brought tears to my eyes, and when he slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt like maybe everything would be okay. Maybe Patricia would finally accept me now that it was official. Maybe we could start fresh as a real family. The reception was everything Patricia had orchestrated, elegant, expensive, and designed to impress. The ballroom sparkled with crystal and candlelight, and the 5-course dinner was prepared by a chef who'd worked at Michelin-starred restaurants. I should have felt like a princess, but instead, I felt like an actress playing a role I'd never auditioned for. During dinner, I noticed Patricia moving from table to table, playing the perfect hostess. She laughed at the right moments, complimented the right people, and made sure everyone knew how much thought had gone into every detail. She was in her element, commanding attention and receiving the praise she craved. But there was something different about her energy tonight. She kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not her usual disapproval, but something more intense, more focused. It made my skin crawl. Eleanor sat at the head table with us, regal in her navy blue dress and pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. She ate quietly, observing the festivities with those sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Occasionally, she'd lean over to whisper something to James or squeeze my hand reassuringly. But mostly she watched. As the evening progressed, the knot in my stomach tightened. Something was coming. I could feel it in the way Patricia kept checking her watch and scanning the room. When the dinner plates were cleared and the DJ announced it was time for speeches, my blood ran cold. James stood first, giving a heartfelt speech about love and partnership that made several guests dab their eyes. My mom spoke next, her voice shaking with emotion as she welcomed James into our small family. A few of his college friends shared funny stories that had everyone laughing. Then Patricia stood up. She didn't wait to be introduced or ask permission. She simply rose from her chair with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, smoothed her designer dress, and moved toward the microphone. The room fell silent, 200 faces turning expectantly toward the mother of the groom. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate my son's wedding," she began, her voice carrying easily across the ballroom. She looked beautiful in her champagne-colored gown, every inch the society matron. As James's mother, I feel it's important to share some thoughts about marriage, family, and the values that bind us together. My heart started pounding. Something about her tone set off every alarm bell in my head. This wasn't going to be a typical mother-in-law speech about gaining a daughter and losing a son. Marriage is about partnership, Patricia continued, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing on me. It's about two families coming together, sharing resources, supporting each other through good times and bad. It's about understanding what each person brings to the relationship. The room was completely silent now, guests sensing the tension even if they couldn't identify its source. James reached for my hand under the table, his palm damp with sweat. Tonight, we're not just celebrating a wedding. We're celebrating my son's generous heart and his willingness to see potential where others might see. She paused dramatically, letting the silence stretch. Well, let's just say James has always been willing to help those less fortunate. My blood turned to ice. She was really going to do this. In front of 200 people on my wedding day, she was going to humiliate me in a way I'd never recover from. James has always had a soft spot for charity cases, Patricia said, her voice growing stronger, more confident. And tonight, I suppose we should acknowledge that our family has opened its doors to someone who truly needed what we could provide. The gasps started then, quiet at first, then growing louder as guests began to understand what they were witnessing. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience, watching this nightmare unfold from somewhere outside myself. Patricia turned to face me directly, her smile sharp as broken glass. So, I'd like to make a toast to my new daughter-in-law, Madison. We've let a beggar and a freeloader into our family, and I suppose we should all admire James's charitable spirit in taking on such a project. The silence that followed was deafening. 200 people sat frozen, unsure whether they'd really heard what they thought they'd heard. My face burned with shame and shock, tears threatening to spill down my cheeks and ruin my makeup. James was on his feet instantly, his face red with anger, but the damage was done. The words hung in the air like poison. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process that this was really happening on what was supposed to be the most beautiful day of my life. Patricia stood there looking satisfied, like she'd finally said what needed to be said. That's when Eleanor stood up. At 85, she moved slowly but with purpose, her cane tapping against the marble floor as she made her way toward the microphone. Patricia stepped aside, probably thinking her mother-in-law would add some gracious words to smooth over the awkwardness. She was wrong. Eleanor adjusted the microphone with hands that shook slightly from age, but not from nerves. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded respect for 8 decades. "I have something to say about character and family values," she began, her eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Patricia with laser focus, "and about the difference between breeding and class." The energy in the room shifted instantly. This wasn't going to be a polite grandmother speech about love and marriage. This was a reckoning. "You see, I've been watching this family for many years now," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've seen people come and go. I've seen fortunes made and lost, and I've learned to recognize real character when I see it." Patricia's face was starting to pale, confusion replacing her earlier satisfaction. "I'd like to tell you all a story about charity cases and freeloaders," Eleanor said, her eyes never leaving her daughter-in-law. "About a young woman who came into this family many years ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a talent for making people believe she was something she wasn't." The room was so quiet you could hear the crystal chandelier tinkling in the air conditioning. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. That young woman was very good at making others forget where she came from, very good at rewriting history to suit her needs, very good at pointing fingers and judging others while conveniently forgetting her own past. Eleanor paused, letting her words sink in. "But I remember everything?" Eleanor reached into her small evening purse and pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age. The entire ballroom held its breath as she unfolded what appeared to be an old letter, her fingers steady despite her years. "This is a letter," she began, her voice carrying across the silent room, "written 32 years ago by a young woman who was desperately seeking help. A young woman who had been evicted from her apartment and was living in her car. A young woman who begged, yes, begged, my family to give her a chance." Patricia's face had gone completely white. She gripped the back of her chair so hard her knuckles showed through her skin. The letter reads, and I quote, "Dear Mrs. Harrison, I know we've only met twice, but I'm writing to ask for your help. I've been evicted and have nowhere to go. I'm willing to work for room and board, to clean, to cook, anything. I promise I won't be a burden. I just need someone to believe in me when no one else will." Eleanor looked up from the letter, her eyes finding Patricia's terrified face. That letter was signed by Patricia Ann Murphy, before she became Patricia Harrison, before she conveniently forgot where she came from. The gasps that rippled through the crowd were audible now. Guests were turning to each other, whispering, trying to process this revelation. I felt like I was watching a movie, unable to believe this was really happening. "My late husband and I took Patricia in," Eleanor continued, her voice unwavering. "We gave her a job in our office, a small apartment above the store, and a chance to prove herself. She was grateful then, humble. She worked hard, I'll give her that. But somewhere along the way, she decided to rewrite her story." Eleanor pulled out another document. This one looked like a photograph. "This is Patricia on her first day of work, 28 years old, wearing a donated dress from the church charity box because she owned nothing else. She lived in our guest house for 2 years while she got on her feet." The photograph was passed from table to table, guests craning their necks to see. Patricia looked young and desperate in the photo, nothing like the polished socialite standing before us now. "She met my son Thomas at a company barbecue 3 years later," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a nostalgic tone. "He was smitten with her determination, her work ethic, her gratitude for every small kindness. The woman he fell in love with bore no resemblance to the person standing here tonight." James was staring at his mother in shock. I realized he'd never heard this story. Patricia had crafted an entirely different narrative about her past, one that involved a middle-class upbringing and a college education she'd never received. "But the most ironic part," Eleanor continued, "is that Patricia hasn't worked a single day in the 28 years since she married my son. Not one day. While Madison here has worked since she was 14, put herself through college, and currently manages the accounting for 3 local businesses." She gestured toward me with genuine pride. "Madison reminds me of the young woman I thought I was helping all those years ago. The difference is, Madison never forgot where she came from. She never became ashamed of her mother's honest work or her own humble beginnings." The crowd was completely riveted now. Some guests were pulling out their phones, probably realizing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. "I have more than just letters and photographs," Eleanor said, reaching into her purse again. "I have bank records showing every penny we spent supporting Patricia during those early years, rent receipts for the apartment we provided, payroll records showing her salary, which, adjusted for inflation, was quite generous for someone with no education or experience." Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Mother Harrison, please." "Oh, now I'm Mother Harrison again?" Eleanor's voice carried a sharp edge. "5 minutes ago, you were comfortable humiliating a young woman who's done nothing but love your son and contribute to this family. But now that your own past is being exposed, suddenly you want family loyalty?" Eleanor turned back to address the crowd. "I've watched Madison work 16-hour days to help James get his business off the ground. I've seen her send money to her mother every month, never missing a payment. I've watched her volunteer at the food bank every Saturday for the past 2 years. Tell me, Patricia, when was the last time you volunteered anywhere? When was the last time you sent your own mother money?" The silence was devastating. Patricia's mother had died years ago, but everyone in that room knew Patricia had cut ties with her family long before then, embarrassed by their working-class status. "The real freeloader," Eleanor said, her voice rising with authority, "is the woman who hasn't contributed a single dollar to this family's income in nearly 3 decades. The woman who spends her days shopping, gossiping, and judging others while living entirely off her husband's hard work." James looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. His whole understanding of his mother's background was crumbling before his eyes. "Mom, is this true?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Patricia's carefully constructed facade was falling apart in real time. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "James, you don't understand?" "What I understand," Eleanor interrupted, "is that you've become exactly the kind of person who would have looked down on you 30 years ago. You've forgotten every lesson about compassion, humility, and gratitude that brought you into this family in the first place." She walked slowly back toward the microphone, her cane tapping with each deliberate step. "Madison has shown more class in the past 5 minutes, sitting quietly while being publicly humiliated, than you've shown in the past 5 years. She's earned her place in this family through love, loyalty, and hard work. The same things you claimed to offer when you were begging for a chance." The crowd was completely absorbed in the drama unfolding before them. Some were crying, others were whispering excitedly to their neighbors. A few were discreetly recording on their phones, probably realizing this would become legendary in their social circle. "I have one more thing to share," Eleanor said, pulling out a final document. "This is my will, which I've recently updated. I want everyone to understand where I stand on the question of who truly belongs in this family." Patricia's face went from white to green. The money. She'd always assumed she'd inherit a significant portion of Eleanor's considerable estate. "I'm leaving 50% of my estate to Madison and James jointly," Eleanor announced. 25% will go to various charities. The remaining 25% will go to Patricia, with one condition: she must work for it. Real work, 40 hours a week for at least 2 years at any job that doesn't involve this family's money or influence. The gasps from the crowd were nothing compared to the strangled sound that came from Patricia's throat. She'd lived her entire adult life without working, assuming she'd eventually inherit enough money to continue that lifestyle indefinitely. The woman I took in 30 years ago would have understood that work gives life meaning, Eleanor continued. Maybe if Patricia remembers what it feels like to earn something, she'll remember what humility looks like. James stood up slowly, his face a mixture of anger, disappointment, and determination. "Mom, I think you should leave," he said quietly. "This is Madison's day, and you've done enough damage." Patricia looked around the room desperately, seeking support from somewhere, anywhere, but the expressions on people's faces ranged from shock to disgust to pity. No one was rushing to defend her behavior. "Thomas would be ashamed of what you've become," Eleanor said, her voice softening with sadness. "He fell in love with a woman who appreciated kindness and worked hard for everything she had. I don't know who you are anymore." The weight of that statement seemed to break something in Patricia. She grabbed her purse and practically ran from the ballroom, her high heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. The door slammed behind her with a resounding bang that seemed to wake everyone from their trance. For a moment, the silence continued. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. I looked up to see it was my mother, tears streaming down her face, applauding Eleanor's courage. The clapping spread through the room like wildfire until the entire ballroom was erupting in applause. Eleanor made her way back to our table, moving slowly but with dignity. When she reached me, she cupped my face in her weathered hands. "Welcome to the family, sweetheart," she said. "The real family." I burst into tears then, not tears of humiliation or anger, but of relief and gratitude. This woman had just risked family relationships to defend me, had sacrificed her own comfort to ensure I knew I belonged. James pulled me into his arms, holding me tight as the crowd continued to applaud. "I'm so sorry," he whispered in my ear. "I had no idea. I should have protected you from her years ago." "You couldn't have known," I whispered back. "But your grandmother, she's incredible." Eleanor tapped her cane against her chair, calling for attention one final time. "Now that we've cleared the air," she said with a slight smile, "I believe there's still a wedding to celebrate. DJ, would you please play something we can dance to?" The tension in the room broke like a fever. Guests began moving toward the dance floor, excited chatter filling the air as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Many stopped by our table to offer congratulations and support, several mentioning how impressed they were with my composure during the entire ordeal. "You handled that with more grace than anyone could have expected," said one of James's aunts, a woman who'd always been polite but distant before tonight. "Patricia should be ashamed of herself." As the evening progressed, something magical happened. The wedding reception transformed from a stuffy society event into a real celebration. Guests who had seemed intimidating before were now approaching me with genuine warmth, sharing their own stories of overcoming challenges and family difficulties. James's uncle, a successful businessman I'd always found intimidating, pulled me aside during dinner. "Eleanor was right about you," he said. "I've been watching how you handle yourself in this family, and you've got real class, the kind that can't be bought or taught." My mother, who had been nervously quiet for most of the evening, was now holding court with several of the older ladies, sharing stories about my childhood and work ethic. For the first time since the engagement, she looked comfortable and proud instead of worried about fitting in. But the most remarkable change was in Eleanor herself. For the past 2 years, she'd been polite but reserved with me, and I'd assumed it was because she shared some of Patricia's doubts about my suitability for the family. Now I realized she'd been watching, evaluating, waiting to see who I really was before deciding where she stood. "I owe you an apology," she said as we sat together during a quiet moment. "I should have spoken up sooner. I should have stopped Patricia's behavior before it got this far." "You didn't owe me anything," I replied. "What you did tonight? I can never thank you enough." "You reminded me of myself at your age," Eleanor said, her eyes distant with memory. "I came from nothing too. Married into money and spent the first decade wondering if I belonged. The difference is, I had a mother-in-law who welcomed me with open arms. I should have been that for you. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, many made a point of saying goodbye to both James and me, treating us like equals for the first time. Several mentioned they'd love to have us over for dinner, extending invitations that felt genuine rather than obligatory. The next morning, James and I were having breakfast in our hotel suite when his phone started ringing. It was his father, calling from his business trip in Europe. Word had already reached him about the wedding reception drama. "I'm mortified," Thomas said, his voice crackling through the international connection. "Eleanor called me this morning and told me everything. I had no idea Patricia had been treating Madison so poorly, and I certainly had no idea about her behavior last night." James put the call on speaker so I could hear. "Dad, did you really not know about Mom's background? About how she met our family?" There was a long pause. "I knew she'd had some financial difficulties before we met," Thomas said carefully. "But she always said it was temporary, that her family had helped her through a rough patch. I didn't realize. Eleanor showed me the letters, son. I'm ashamed that I never pressed for more details." "Where is she now?" James asked. "She's staying at the downtown hotel," Thomas replied. "She called me this morning, hysterical, demanding that I make Eleanor apologize and take back what she said about the will. I told her that if anyone owes apologies, it's her." Over the next few weeks, the fallout from our wedding reception continued to ripple through the family and social circle. Patricia had indeed checked into a downtown hotel and was apparently telling anyone who would listen that Eleanor was suffering from dementia and didn't know what she was saying. But the evidence Eleanor had presented was too comprehensive to dismiss. Other family members began sharing their own memories of Patricia's early years, stories that supported everything Eleanor had revealed. James's cousin mentioned finding old photographs in her mother's albums that showed Patricia in clearly worn, ill-fitting clothes during family gatherings in the early years. Most significantly, Thomas flew home early from his business trip to have a serious conversation with his wife. According to James, it didn't go well. Patricia demanded that Thomas choose between her and his mother, insisting that Eleanor was trying to destroy their marriage out of jealousy. Thomas, to his credit, refused to make that choice. Instead, he suggested that Patricia seek counseling to understand why she'd felt the need to reinvent her past so completely and why she'd become so threatened by me. Patricia's response was to pack her bags and move in with her sister 2 states away, claiming she needed time to think about whether she wanted to remain married to a man who wouldn't defend her against his family's lies. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Patricia was now living as a dependent on someone else's charity. Exactly the situation she'd accused me of being in. Meanwhile, my relationship with the rest of James's family transformed completely. His aunts and uncles, who had previously been polite but distant, now included me in family group chats and made an effort to get to know me as an individual rather than as an extension of James. Most importantly, Eleanor and I developed a real friendship. She began joining James and me for Sunday dinners, sharing stories about the family history and teaching me about the business that would someday be partially mine. She also shared her own struggles with fitting into a wealthy family, helping me understand that my feelings of inadequacy were normal and temporary. "The secret," she told me one Sunday afternoon as we sat in her garden, "is to never forget where you came from, but also never let it limit where you're going." Patricia forgot the first part. You'll never make that mistake. 6 months after our wedding, Patricia filed for divorce. She claimed irreconcilable differences and asked for a substantial alimony settlement, arguing that she'd given up her career to support Thomas's ambitions. The request was denied when Eleanor's evidence showed that Patricia had never had a career to give up. In the end, Patricia received a modest settlement, enough to live comfortably if she managed it wisely, but nowhere near enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. The last I heard, she was working as a receptionist at a real estate office, something she found deeply humiliating but financially necessary. As for us, our marriage grew stronger through the trial. James and I learned to communicate about difficult family situations, and he made it clear that my comfort and happiness would always be his priority. We bought a small house near Eleanor's, and I often stopped by to help her with errands or just to chat. A year later, when Eleanor suffered a mild stroke, I was the one who stayed with her during her recovery. As we sat in her hospital room, she squeezed my hand and said, "I'm so glad James found you. You're the daughter I always wanted." That's when I realized that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. Eleanor had chosen to stand up for me when it mattered most, and in doing so, she'd given me something I'd never had before, a mother figure who believed in me unconditionally. The wedding reception that was supposed to humiliate me had instead become the moment I truly joined the Harrison family. Not through marriage, but through fire. And sometimes that's the strongest foundation of all.